I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for this morning, Mr. Richard Reinsch, who will be speaking on the truth about Built Better Than They Knew studies. Mr. Reinsch is the founding editor of Liberty Fund's online journal, Law and Liberty, where he also hosts the podcast Liberty Law Talk, which features interviews with academics and writers in law and political thought. He is co-author with Peter Lawler of A Constitution in Full, The Unwritten Foundation of American Liberty, the author of Whitaker Chambers, The Spirit of a Counter-Revolutionary, and the editor of Seeking the Truth, an Orestes Brownson anthology. Mr. Reinsch's writings have appeared in Perspectives on Political Science, National Affairs, American Affairs, The American Conservative, Modern Age, National Review and National Review Online, and the University Bookman. He received his law degree in 2004 from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and practiced law in securities, mergers, and acquisitions until arriving at the Liberty Fund in 2007. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Richard Reinsch.
So my task today, as I think about this, Built Better Than They Knew studies, is somewhat of a mad streak, because this is obviously a dissident understanding of American constitutionalism. It's one that is not widely well known. Scholars have talked about it or referenced it. They tend to be Catholic, they tend to be conservative, they tend to be, I guess, like me. It came to me when I started at Liberty Fund in hospitality sessions, late night drinking sessions, and from two scholars in particular, both of whom used to be fixtures in the honors program and indeed in a lot of ISI programs, Peter Lawler and Daniel Mahoney. Peter, of course, unfortunately passed away in 2017. He was, at the time, the editor of Modern Age. But the conversations go on. And Peter, at the time, we were working on our book for Kansas Press, A Constitution in Full. And I had enough of his work, I was able to go forward and publish it. So, Built Better Than They Knew studies, the truth about it. So, I am not arguing in this line of thought that what we have received from the American founding is somehow ill-founded, or that we can't have confidence in it, or that it's not a real and enduring and truthful achievement about the human person, law, constitutionalism, civil society. I would never take a progressive line of tack there. But what I will argue today is that they are situated within a line of thought that extends beyond them, that perhaps they did not fully understand, and that leading documents from the ratifiers, from the framers, should be put in conversation with the full Western tradition, and indeed that they invite that. And we can come to think of them, I think, in a more enduring way when we do that. If we think about, ask yourself the question, what is the meaning of American constitutionalism? What is this all about? I think the two regnant explanations of our era, not that there aren't many, but the ones that we're faced with now don't provide a satisfying answer. They're partial answers. They are, I think, baked in modern ideology. For that reason, I find them abstract. I find them not fully conversant with the concrete reality of the human person and the problem of human freedom. So think about one, right? The libertarian Lockean rights rationale of the American founding, which I think in our time received its most poignant expression from retired Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy in a range of opinions, perhaps dating from the Planned Parenthood versus Casey opinion in 1992, all the way up through Obergefell v. Hodges. So in abortion, sexuality, marriage, religion, what do we get from Kennedy? And he's not shy about it. He's very forthright. And in fact is saying, I am deriving a philosophy, I am making it constitutional law from one word, the word liberty, in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So it's not even an incorporation debate necessarily, it's just, here's the word liberty. And what does the word liberty mean according to Kennedy? Right, that autonomous individuals in the story of American constitutionalism are more and more dislodged and disattached from state and local laws that would purport to situate them within a context of family, of religion, of childbearing. That's, I think, finally the truth of American abortion law, that we release women from childbearing. And that this is sort of what it means to be constitutional in America. Think about a related, and I say related, maybe dialectically related, the progressive understanding of American constitutionalism that we all know very well. Highly individualistic when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to, for the most part, individual expression, though that seems to be changing. There seems to be moves against sort of a aggressive free speech regime in progressive thinking, but that the goal is something like an egalitarian morality, and it's sort of man and the state. Perhaps a poignant expression of that was Barack Obama's 2012 presidential campaign. If you will recall, I don't think this predates you guys, the Life of Julia cartoon, if anyone remembers that. I thought, and also at the National Convention, Democratic National Convention, what was the phrase that you saw again and again? Government is the only thing we all belong to. But the Life of Julia cartoon, you had a young woman whose entire life was lived in partnership with the government. Her education, she raises a child as a single parent. We never hear about a husband or a father. She starts a business with the loan from the federal government. She works most of her life. She then retires with the federal government. Everything is sort of in partnership with the state. There is no sort of thick lumpiness conception of human personhood, of what it means to live a rich and satisfying life. And as I was thinking about this talk, it occurs to me, perhaps it is our unease. Perhaps it is our sense that these two dominant answers right now, competing for our understanding, aren't providing satisfying answers that have invited what we've been living with now for the last couple of years and what I would think of as sort of anti-constitutional talk. We got Professor Bush, I thought, displayed that well. Critical rights theory is not constitutional thinking, right? It can't make sense of the rule of law. It can't make sense of equality under law. It can't make sense of limited government. It cannot make sense of constitutionalism. It is a totalitarian move in favor of racialized socialism. That's the end goal. That's what the state is about. And we also have, although not as powerful, but certainly something you guys are all familiar with, if we think about the rise of integralism, typically associated with Catholic scholars, although I think there are some Protestant ones who are trying to catch up. But this idea that the Constitution is very much ill-founded and is rooted in deformed understandings of nature, of individualism, of liberty, and this is now starting to really show. This is starting to become evident as sort of the final truth of our order, and what we have to do is refound America on, as Patrick Mead would say, better truths. We have to be better than who we are. So that's sort of the context of Built Better Than They Knew studies. The approach itself derived from an 1884 report by the Third Plenary Council of American Catholic Bishops, which proclaimed, quote, "We consider the establishment of our country's independence, the shaping of its liberties and laws, as a work of special providence, its framers building better than they knew, the Almighty's hand guiding them," end quote. Now, the bishop's use of this statement invites our argument that our founders' constitutional achievement, while of incredible significance in its own right, contained within it foundational connections to the full legacy of the Western political heritage. As such, our founders built as statesmen, not as theorists. They built for the ages and were not fully aware of the real shape and meaning of their constitutional glory, of their achievement. But this understandable lack of knowledge by the founders as to the deep significance of what they had actually done meant that their political descendants, in the words of John Courtney Murray, had to develop upon, quote, pain of decadence, to develop and bring out the measure of the American founding as challenge and opportunities arose. So I'll develop the thinking of Alexis de Tocqueville, who I'm sure most of you have read, John Courtney Murray, and Orestes Bronson, who I think are sort of the three players of Built Better Than They Knew studies in this talk. Now, as Lawler noted in his introduction to John Courtney Murray's We Hold These Truths, a reprint edition that came out in 2010, he said, quote, "We hold these truths because they built better than they knew. They themselves could not be relied upon to give an adequate account of what they had done. In order to defend our Constitution effectively today, our duty as citizens is to give it a better theoretical foundation than its framers did. So thinking about our three thinkers, joining together their contributions, Tocqueville, Bronson, Murray, is the notion that while the American founding was an incredible achievement, it had, like anything else human beings create, certain deficiencies, certain pitfalls. So perhaps the largest pitfall, I argue, is the notion that the founding should be understood in exclusively Lockean social contract terms, situating government as an entity autonomous individuals create for the protection of property rights and individual security. Tocqueville's contribution, among many contributions Tocqueville makes, but from the earliest beginnings in our country, colonies in both the North and the South, New England and Virginia, and remember, for Tocqueville, New England is the point of departure for understanding America, had divergent views about the contents of human liberty and virtue. Tocqueville thought that both the Northerners and the Southerners have certain truthful elements, although neither captures liberty in its full dimensions. And so the conclusion is that America, at its constitutional best, tries to moderate in an almost Aristotelian fashion the partial truths of colonial North and South, between New England and Virginia, between intrusive Puritans and the laissez-faire treasure hunters of Virginia. Bronson provides the most theoretically rich treatment of why the conventional Lockean framework is not only inadequate to explain the founding, but also contributed to the political failure of our Constitution in Southern secessionism. His stresses on two concepts for understanding American constitutionalism: territorial democracy and the providential constitution. Providential constitution underscores something that I think is quite sane, that our founders could only build on what they were given by history and circumstance. Territorial democracy means that only relational beings, bound and loyal to a defined patch of earth and its laws and obligations, could ever govern themselves in a Republican manner. So I think if you look at the Roger Scruton reading we have in the reading packet, The Truth About Nationalism, much of what Bronson is saying here about territorial democracy, I think equates well with what Scruton argues in terms of law and territory. Finally, John Courtney Murray, the 20th century Jesuit who wrote theology, political philosophy, constitutional law, provides the natural law framework for a better defense of our constitutionalism, a defense made in the spirit of Abraham Lincoln, but not just Lincoln, and one predicated on the notion that American government stands or falls based on our commitment to the American proposition of truths about man, government, and law. So the American proposition, when I use that term, I'm not necessarily using it in a narrow ideological way that you might associate with neocons or sort of second wave neoconservatism, or even Irving Kristol had a great essay, classic essay on this, The Propositional Nation. I don't mean it in that sense. When I say the American proposition, or as Murray uses it, it is an invitation to reflect on liberty, constitutional law, and the full classical heritage that we have in the sense of moral realism, that moral experience reflects on truths that are given to us, that is to say, natural law, and that this becomes a way to sort of bring achievements higher from the founding. So I think the gateway drug to Built Better Than They Knew studies was provided by Peter in the 2005 ISI book, Stuck with Virtue, where he says, quote, "The reason we can see beyond the modern world is that its intention to transform human nature has failed. Its project of transforming the human person into an autonomous individual was and remains unrealistic. We can now see its limits because we remain more than individuals," end quote. The problem for serious students of the American founding is that its two foundational documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, are increasingly viewed in the light of Lockean individualistic political philosophy, We have endeavored to make this the rule of our politics and the best understanding of who we are. And the Declaration easily supports that reading. It's built on Lockean thinking in many respects, on the notion that man creates government to protect natural rights, which are really private rights of the individual. The God who is the origin of these rights is the past tense deist God, theologically incapable of loving or caring for particular persons. This God and the nature that he created is impersonal. So man is the real actor here as citizen, the author and destroyer of governments. His political judgments, predicated on how well government secures his property rights and security. Human beings in their full relational capacities, as husbands, wives, fathers, mothers, children, religious believers, are mentioned neither in the Declaration or in the Constitution, for that matter. Thus, the Declaration, which has become the philosophical anchoring piece of American constitutional thinking, supports our individualism. And the Constitution, likewise, can be seen to do so. We are not defined in the Constitution by race, by class, by gender, or religious belief. I'm not saying that we should be. But the Constitution does not acknowledge our people's dependence on God or the past. We consent to government as individuals. It does not speak of our relational roles and responsibilities. We Americans are equal in our liberty, and that is the greatness of our Constitution. Our national Constitution is a construction, in the sense that we know it was invented by human beings for a construction, the individual, invented by Locke and other modern thinkers. So the truth in this view is that what our limited Constitution points to regarding our status as beings who are individuals, but who are also more than individuals. That's the truth that we should recover. That's what seems to be eclipsed by a Lockean notion. Well, all the reason that just as significant as the text was the Constitution's silence on how Americans would actually live together as neighbors, parents, religious believers, and children. Now, the constitutions of the states and the laws passed under their authority were the real regulatory muscle in this regard. That's where morality was meant to be enforced. The problem is the 14th Amendment, which we are told by the Supreme Court beginning in the 1940s, incorporated most of the protections in the Bill of Rights against the laws of the states, and does so in a fashion very secular, I would argue, individualistic, and basically, supporting what I've been talking about, has hollowed out these state constitutional provisions or laws, deemed morally traditionalist or religious in orientation. So the path that has marked our period since this period is one of Lockean argumentation and has been built on the word liberty in the 14th Amendment. So we have seen this eclipse what states could do, and what that means is the ability to challenge these ideas and understandings politically has been removed from us. No room for a minority of states, say like from my part of the country, the South, which would definitely challenge a lot of what's happened over the last 60 or 70 years, has been allowed to occur to test the end of history in this regard. But the truth is, and built better than the new studies would say, America is not a consolidated modern nation state with only two intertwined paths, centralization or liberal individualism. This is the trap of modern thought. This is sort of the two poles that it moves around. Again, if you think the only two densities are man and the state, you end up wildly oscillating between those two. So a nation with a soul of the church, and Chesterton's formulation, is composed of intense religious faiths, courageous patriotism. We still have a spirited sense of self-government and a jealous regard for our liberty. Americans have not understood themselves exclusively to be working out the ineluctable progress to the end of history. We have no working theory for how we are to be constitutional, but we have a series of practices and approaches to being Republican and self-governing that issue from our founding. So our need at this time, that Lawler articulated along with Bronson and Murray, is to find a theory worthy of our great country, and the practices and settlements we have made as a people who often profoundly disagree with one another politically. So thinking about Tocqueville and the challenge Tocqueville issues here. Democracy in America, the development of American philosophy of liberty. Tocqueville says those who founded Virginia were looking to score commercially and were of the adventurous sport. They hailed from the lower ranks of English society and lacked nobility of character and devotion to religion. Tocqueville says what's worse, their desire for wealth, for the quick take, was not informed by what we would call the bourgeois virtues. That is to say, they desired wealth, but did not have a middle-class devotion that it should be the fruit of one's honest labor. Now, Tocqueville's more favorable description of the Puritans notes that they built their colony of Massachusetts without established class ranks. Their spiritual devotion informed their egalitarianism. All right, so finding wealth or making a pile of wealth wasn't their primary concern. And these were people who belonged to a certain elevated class in the mother country and risked a lot to come here. Religion, morality, and family structured their world. Unlike the Virginians, they brought their wives and children with them. The Puritans were incredibly well educated, who Tocqueville observes had a purely intellectual need to make an idea triumph. In short, they were civilized, and the Virginians were not. But that isn't the final word. For the Puritans were too uptight, moralistic, and forgetting their Christianity, they made every sin a legal crime. So Virginians had something to teach our early moralists about the law's inability to legislate comprehensively a life of virtue. But this early comparison points to the need to synthesize, balance, and compromise from the beginning our competing understandings of liberty and responsibility, with neither the libertinism of the Virginians or the constricted morality of the Puritans providing the final word on whose doctrine should be enforced. Of course, for Tocqueville, there were more encompassing threats than religious majoritarianism to liberty. The threat, he would argue, he does argue, comes from within liberalism. So if you look at the second volume of Democracy America, which is full of these reflections, it's the dogmatic liberalism that would reduce us below the level of human persons. That is the ultimate threat to American liberty. We no longer see one another as distinctive beings with rights to pursue our relational lives. We are reduced to entities that are part of a cosmic whole. The exercise of freedom and the attempts at human greatness cease to matter as we no longer believe in the worthiness of our personhood. So Tocqueville calls this pantheism, and he greatly fears its workings in democracy because we lose the relational aspects of our human existence and come to see ourselves as flotsam, mere flotsam, in the grand sea of historical forces. So the question of human liberty is eviscerated in this understanding, and a deterministic understanding of the person that seems to remove us from thinking about liberty or drawing limits to human liberty and seeing us merely as a whole. One way of thinking about this in our time is humanitarianism. Humanitarianism as an ideology which struggles to make sense even of something like the nation state, struggles to make sense of maybe migrations of people from different civilizations and cultures to the West in grand fashion really isn't such a great idea. And we need to think more clearly about that. But the great fear voiced by Tocqueville was that in the dawning centuries of democracy, individual independence and local liberties will always be the products of art, but centralized government will be the natural thing, end quote. So how to maintain the spirit of liberty against the spread of an enervating individualism which reduces citizens and isolates them from one another? Now, I think in this regard, Lawler pointed to Tocqueville's observation that Americans are too restless and too miserable to ever finally be at home in this conception of individualism and its incessant pursuits of technological mastery. Our endless pursuit of gain, even while we know it doesn't produce happiness, is evidence that our longings are not for the goods of this world. So the misery and greatness of human beings in liberal democracies the misery and greatness of people who live in the most prosperous and the freest political orders, but don't find themselves satisfied. So where Tocqueville points to particular clues about human nature and practices, like local self-government, the arts of association and religion, which stave off the isolating and individual effects of democracy, it was Orestes Bronson who, in the most comprehensive fashion, in 1865 provides his own counter-theory on constitutionalism, one that challenged social contract theory as the understanding of American constitutionalism. Now, Tocqueville does that as well. Tocqueville ignores the Declaration of Independence and says the point of departure or the beginning of American, the social state, he says, of America is really with the Puritans. And that's where he looks to think about liberty, politics, character formation in America. So Bronson writes in 1865, right, the failure of the Civil War, the failure of the country, the American Republic. And he does this, he says, I want to teach my country what is true knowledge of its Constitution, which he says it has missed. And he says it has missed because, in one reason, the social contract theory used by Americans and their statesmen to justify their government is, quote, held to be a voluntary association of individuals. Individuals create civil society and may uncreate it whenever they judge it advisable, end quote. But this empirically deficient constitutional theory was also an insufficient basis for thinking about how to maintain a constitutional republic. So Bronson's immediate and compelling evidence, he thinks, is the Civil War. America had never been able to understand its own constitution. Quote, among nations, no one has more need of full knowledge of itself than the United States, and no one has hitherto had less, Bronson states. The goal of American constitutionalism, quote, its idea is liberty indeed, but liberty with law and law with liberty. Yet its mission is not so much the realization of liberty as the realization of the true idea of the state, which secures at once the authority of the public and the freedom of the individual, the sovereignty of the people without social despotism, and individual freedom without anarchy. In other words, its mission is to bring out in its life the dialectic union of authority and liberty, of the natural rights of man and those of society. So the Lockean understanding, Bronson says, builds government on abstract rights and autonomous individuals. In its theoretical purity, it makes man the origin of government through his consent and self-ownership. But if government is an artificial contrivance of human beings for their benefit, then what will limit its power? And the answer of natural rights is an illusion, Bronson thought. The most significant reason why is if man, through his creative activity, is the measure, he becomes his own standard, and there is no transcendent will that will limit and order man's action. So modern social contract thinking is really the origin of political atheism, and its effectual truth is that it makes man God. So Bronson, looking at the Declaration, emphasized the equality of all men by nature under God. Quote, under the law of nature, all men are equal or have equal rights as men. One man has and can have in himself no right to govern another, and as man is never absolutely his own, but always and everywhere belongs to his Creator, it is evident that no government originating in humanity alone can be a legitimate government, end quote. So I think a connection drawing this out with Build Better Than They Knew studies is that government's origins might be framed in a contract. We could specify terms in a contract, but it's built on the pre-existing fact that man is born into society, into political society, and is indebted to it for his existence. The effort to define a government of ordered liberty must make real the enduring truth about God and man in the constitution of a government. So the problem America faced was that its secessionist Southerners had actually taken the founding teaching to heart. And they couldn't really be accused of treason, Bronson says. He doesn't think they're ultimately right. As I've laid out, he doesn't think this is the best understanding, but it's regnant. It's opinion. It's very dominant opinion. And the Southerners weren't the first. The 1814 Hartford Convention, where New England states threatening secession over a political perceived injustice to their property at that time. So that the consent of the states made the Union, and that consent could be withdrawn was not a position unique to Southern slave owners. Bronson did not think secession was correct, but that political Lockeanism had been the prevalent doctrine in both the North and the South. And if this doctrine, shoehorning government into something artificially generated for the protection of private liberties and bourgeois virtue could be undone if it no longer protected those private interests. So the Southerners had acted to type. But the good news, Bronson says, is that our founders employed Lockean terms to explain their act of separation and constitutional independence from tyrannical government, but never employed the full theory in the construction of the Constitution. Therefore, a more grounded political, historical, and anthropological thesis was needed to understand America's constitutional liberty. Bronson's concept of providential constitution, he proffered to replace the social contract. There must be, he says, quote, for every state or nation, a constitution anterior to the constitution which the nation gives itself, and from which the one it gives itself derives all its vitality and legal force, end quote. So the providential constitution isn't necessarily a claim on a divine intervention into American political life that would somehow, so this is not like American exceptionalism on steroids. I don't want you to think that. But it's a common sense observation that no constitution could emerge from nothing. And you're working with the historical elements you're given, that you're going to use to shape and make real and make possible your constitution. So these elements are not an attempt. This idea is that a civilizational accomplishment is made possible with a written constitution built on something that is unwritten. And then it's a more truthful account of American political unity compared to the social contract account, and as such serves as a better guide to the conflicts and has potentialities that would manifest themselves in better ways. And setting limits to how our Constitution can develop, it provides an architecture of devotion to the actual Constitution. So this concrete political thinking builds on the idea of the polis, but with a representative self-government that the colonists had participated in since their arrival. Moreover, the American understanding of rights is suffused with the Christian belief in man's equality and dignified status under a loving and personal God. So we're more than citizens. We are relational creatures through our devotion to God. And as relational creatures who are more than individuals, our common good is achieved by fulfilling our duties to others. So our country is more than a tribal or a collective selfishness. And as our Declaration does affirm, our constitutional liberties are under a universal yet still relational God. So the founders created a new constitution, but they were guided by custom, law, tradition, philosophy, theology, and prior political experience. And our written constitution has to be understood from its common law heritage, the colonist practice of self-government, religious pluralism throughout the colonies, the unity of the colonies in warfare, democratic immigration patterns, and colonial resistance and independence from the British Empire that had abused its own constitutional tradition in harassing the colonists. So this last element helps us make sense, or better sense, I think, of why we are citizens of both states and the Union. It reflects the fact that while the colonists were subjects of individual colonies, they had united and achieved their independence together. So the colonist political voices found a unified expression in colonial political bodies, most significantly the Continental Congress. And the Articles of Confederation, we have a better way of thinking about this, right? It was an immature political form, born of a war, that did not actually reflect the unwritten constitution of unity of the colonists. And so as a certain amount of maturity entered in, they realized they needed to slough it off and actually build the Constitution of 1787 that reflects a limited political unity of citizens organized in a national and state bond, which at best realizes man's capacity for self-government that moves from a local community outward to larger spheres of interaction, allowing for greater human flourishing. So the limited political unity is best explained by the concept Bronson employed to help us understand why a modern Republican political order can only really be maintained by relational, meaning social, loving, trusting, political creatures, who are both more and less than citizens. So just as we struggle to understand the constitutional formation of our country on abstract Lockean terms, we can also scarcely believe that a Republican political order could be maintained on those same terms alone. So territorial democracy, Bronson's concept of the American Republic, amounts to a common sense position that Republican political authority is built on public trust, loyalty, limited and defined territory, and relational creatures. He says, quote, in situating territorial democracy within Western political thought, the characteristic of barbarism is that it makes all authority a private or personal right. And the characteristic of civilization is that it makes it a public trust, end quote. The crucial characteristic of barbarian authority is that it is oriented fundamentally to the private aims of the ruler or ruling group. But, quote, the state that is republican is constituted by public, not private wealth. And that wealth is held as a public trust, not a private right, where wealth is the private estate of the sovereign, end quote. The crucial distance between the republican and the barbarian despot is the political meaning of territory. The state is territorial. That is, the people, the citizens of the territorial nation, are constituted as such by their loyalty and trust in the law that runs with and is limited to their land. It is not the fruit of citizens resembling one another in terms of race or religion or genealogy, but that they associate their political rights and their liberties and duties with a common and defined territory by law. The essential role of public trust is improved by the Christian intervention of man's eternal personal significance because of his creation by a loving creator. The loyalty of modern Republican citizens upholds that public trust is not the loyalty of the classical Athenians or Romans, but the loyalty of citizens whose personal dignity is not given or defined by that territorial political order. Politics, even its nobility, its best practice of protecting a cherished way of life that has led to human flourishing, is only a limited capability that produces a measured unity. No longer after the Christian intervention can the state enforce the definitive, truthful way to think about who we are. And after the Christian Revolution, lawful Republican government cannot destroy independent religious authorities or ignore the consciences of citizens and their quest to understand God. So we can understand this best if we compare it to the French Revolution, which did aim to do that, and attempted to recreate the conditions of pagan republicanism. This form of republicanism demanded the repudiation of any institution that stood between man and the power of the state to define the collective will of the people. Thus, the French revolutionary government sought to destroy the church because it derived its origin and purpose from a standpoint beyond the state and stood as a permanent reminder to French citizens of a truth above revolutionary ideology. Loyalty. Bronson says the modern world is at war with loyalty to family, to God, to our country. It can only make sense of really one thing. Loyalty touches on the fact that public authority is a civilized and civilizing agent. The proper use of political power demands civic virtue on the part of citizens, a virtue inculcated and activated by our loyalty to the territorial order and the political life it has achieved. Political loyalty is to a common way of life, who dwell to a particular people in a particular part of the world. And it is built on the truthful observation that, quote, we necessarily find ourselves at home in particular places, and even natural rights to become effective have to be secured by a particular order. Political order is about justice, understood as a good shared in common, as opposed to the selfish loyalties demanded by tribes, tyrants, or dislocated individuals, end quote. But loyalty is not universal. It can't be. And it should not be understood as the attempt to supplant or conquer nations in the name of our own or remake others in our political image. So we're loyal here to something that precedes us, that will hopefully go beyond after us, something that has been shaped by our tradition, a politics shaped by it, and it's good, and it's enduring. And this very fact that it's ours should lead us also to have gratitude for its achievement, and we should be willing to maintain it and refine it. So territorial democracy is just that, loyalty to a territory, to a patch of earth, and to mutual accountability of rulers and ruled. So this last aspect of relational creatures means that the best account of who we are as human beings is not given to us by our modern liberal theorists. They would reduce us to just rights bearers who create a government for purely private interests. So it's that paucity of modern liberalism, the theoretic paucity for public authority, that reduces politics to the private and partial interest of a despotic order. We can the politics of a stable, limited, and publicly accountable Republican order exist without the differentiated dimensions of the person that Bronson articulates and that Peter frequently noted in his own work. Bronson underscores that human beings must provide for themselves and for their families, so economic freedom must be affirmed by the state. Man must be permitted to work out with others in religion his eternal destiny, to understand the truth about himself. Can government interfere with this in any way? No, he says. Man is also crucially dependent on the political order to protect these good things. So these natural and relational activities are an approximation of the common good that the government must protect because they unite us to one another and to our country. And while family, religion, work can be viewed as private activities of individuals, they better accord with the view that we finite, dependent, and embodied human beings must realize the aspects of our human nature in relationship with others. So the contrast of Bronson and Lawler's republicanism with the state as an invention of ahistorical, autonomous selves in a state of nature, who are trying to find more effectual ways to protect their commercial rights pursuits, is obvious. Bronson's focus removes man from such an order, and it rebuilds politics and political order as a natural institution of human beings that, when operating at its best, protects and supports the relational personhood that I've been describing. So you might be asking yourself, what does all of this amount to? What does it mean? I mean, could we not just, we have the Declaration, we have the Constitution, we have Publius. Do we need all this extra baggage, this extra stuff? Are you adding unnecessary layers to our understanding of constitutionalism? There's something we can get there a lot faster, in other words, to something sane and good. But that's where I think John Courtney Murray comes in, and sort of the deformed modern political categories. In short, Murray asks, and Murray is often pilloried by other Catholics as sort of soft, spirit of Vatican II. He's sort of trying to help the Catholic Church get comfortable with being American, and so he's sort of preparing it for sort of the post-1960s social order. I mean, there's sort of all sorts of charges. Jeffersonian, all of these sorts of things. But he's actually very pessimistic and bleak, writing in the mid-20th century about our country. And he says, are we still capable of believing in the American proposition? So this is Murray's phrase. It builds on Lincoln's use of the term proposition and his statesmanship that insisted the metaphysical truth of human equality under God become the architectonic truth of our constitutional order. But Lincoln merely confronted the rather obvious problem of overcoming slavery. So part of that was to convince black and whites, or to insist that blacks and whites were equal under God and our law. So Lincoln changes our way of thinking about the constitutional order. Murray's different problem, which we're in too, was rooted in both the skepticism of the modern mind, regarding our ability to hold in common moral truths. 2 minutes. Okay. So he wonders whether and to what extent this nation, this is Murray talking, now no longer new, still remains dedicated to the conception of itself that first constituted us as a people organized for action in history. Or are we still a people, properly speaking, right now? Do we still have a common purpose that is the foundation for our collective action? Does being an American citizen now mean anything at all? Murray answers these questions in the negative. We no longer believe that our Constitution is founded on a certain body of objective truth, accessible to the reason of man. Thus, we need to rehabilitate the American proposition, rooted in the fact that the American political community was organized in an era when the tradition of natural law and natural rights was still vigorous. Claiming no sanction other than its appeal to free minds, it still commanded universal acceptance, and it furnished the basic materials for the American consensus. As Murray also said, quote, "There are truths, and we hold them, and we here lay them down as the basis and inspiration of the American project, this constitutional commonwealth." End quote. My time is running out. So a way to summarize or to think about this, ending on Murray, is Murray says the best truth of the First Amendment is that it is built on man as a sacred being, has possessing interior dignity from God. The final truth of the First Amendment, of our religion clauses, is something that issues from a medieval conception of freedom of the church. That is to say, religion is something we do in common with one another. And that freedom of the church provides the ultimate covering, he uses the word armature, for all of these things that we're going to do ultimately in civil society apart from the government. Now, we changed that to conscience in our time. We don't talk about freedom of the church. I would argue that's a reduced conception because it doesn't make sense of the human person again. You find many conservatives appealing to James Madison's memorial and remonstrance for the definitive account of American religious freedom, and there's a lot of good in that document. It's built on conscience, and it's hard to understand conscience apart from God, I would argue, apart from an order higher than man's nature that he is responding to. And yet Madison works out in this document a conception of religion that I don't think anyone really practices. That is to say, it's something you do by yourself, and it's something ahistorical or outside of any society. I think another part of Built Better Than They Knew studies is taking documents like that, taking the Bill of Rights and asking yourself, there's something truthful here, but there's something also missing here. There's something we need to bring up, to bring forward, to bring out and draw out. And there are concrete instances where this has occurred, even very recently in the Hosanna-Tabor case, a Supreme Court case, unanimous 9-0 decision in 2012, where a Lutheran church had fired a minister for its own purposes. And the Obama government was literally arguing that civil rights law should now extend to church doors. And what you begin to see in the Supreme Court opinion is this development of freedom of the church at that level, the recognition that individual religious freedom may not be enough. So I will conclude with that. We can talk a lot more in the Q&A, but I think I'm now out of time.
Hi, thank you so much for the lecture. So my question has to do with the constitutional ideas articulated by Murray and Brunson. I'm just curious as to how they would particularly manifest in our legal system today. You mentioned Hosanna-Tabor and what that did for religious institutional freedom. I'm just curious whether or not their type of philosophy means that we have to recognize certain religious truths about the polis, whether that you can have maybe perhaps a different, come to the same truths but from a different perspective, and just how applying what you're talking about today and how that would manifest in other constitutional issues as well. So that's like kind of two questions smashed into one, but.
Okay. Yeah, no, the Hosanna-Tabor case, was, and there was another, there's a lot to work with when you think about the Obama administration and religious liberty. The other area where I thought freedom of the church was called for was the contraceptive mandate and the way the contraceptive mandate was applied to religious nonprofits. And it sort of raised also the question of, is a mere individual conception of religious liberty going to be enough if we're actually serious about protecting this right? Also with regard to same-sex marriage. In oral arguments, Obergefell v. Hodges, the Obama administration Solicitor General, Verrilli, flat out said in response to a question from Justice Alito that the issue of higher education or educational institutions in particular who say had a code of conduct not supporting the new same-sex marriage or same-sex rights or gay rights in the code, that they could lose their nonprofit status. And Solicitor General said, yes, I think that's definitely on the table. There was sort of an outcry after that, and they sort of walked that back a bit. But theoretically, I think he was right under the terms that he's arguing. One way in which this sort of came out in this is the big contraceptive mandate case with Hobby Lobby. And in a concurring opinion, Justice Kennedy argued in his own way that religious liberty is like, it's almost like an identity. It's almost like something that becomes who you are and defines who you are. And I would say, yeah. Now, because that's right, you shouldn't be imperiled, even in an institutional context, as to how you exercise it. And that was, of course, the argument that you can't actually bring it into a business if you're a corporate owner. And so he seemed to be, thinking through this stuff at a level of something that would be provided by freedom of the church. Not that he would say it, but freedom of the church type thinking. All of these things that I was trying to describe, it's not as if the documents, I don't think that I'm imposing a forced reading of the document. I think it's a possible rendering, and I would argue, in light of, it's a more truthful account of say, something like religious freedom, of something like freedom of association. And also historically, where do these rights begin to be derived from? And I'm thinking, where do we begin to derive these rights from? Well, it's something that human liberty matters, and that your responsibility for the exercise of your liberty matters. And that mattering necessarily takes into account things that are shared by people in common. It's also, thinking about the point that I started with on Tocqueville in the North and the South, and sort of that we're immediately going to disagree with each other on basic ideas from the beginning. It's sort of baked into the cake with our country. So how do you best account for that, or what would be the best account for that? And I think there it's just this idea of it's a Republican country, and things are supposed to be forged in debate and compromise and delay and waiting and trying to preserve liberty as much as possible by recognizing that because you have power today, you may not have it tomorrow. And so you want to try and work things out with that level while also being aware of which layer of government you're speaking at. That's something that Bronson in particular takes great care. I couldn't really develop it in this talk, but that federalism isn't merely a break on government. It's also a way of thinking about how do human beings flourish in particular contexts. And because we've been given this continental nation and forged something in this continental nation, we should keep that in mind as we think about how human beings interact with one another. So I don't know if that maybe provides something of an answer to your question.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your lecture. What I wanted to ask is, you referenced the view in your lecture that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution don't really mention much more than sort of individuals coming together to create sort of their state. Mm-hmm. But the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence mentions one people dissolving their political bonds with another people. And I wanted to know if you think there's anything to the idea that maybe the Declaration of Independence does acknowledge a sort of national community that exists prior to political statehood or an organized public polity.
And that, great question, and I wasn't able to really fully develop that because of my poor time management today. But the Declaration of Independence is a mishmash when we're thinking about these concepts in many respects. So we've got God, we've got sort of the God of the philosophers, right? We've got the Creator. We also have, against Jefferson's wishes in the Continental Congress, when the document is put forward, we have insertions of a relational creating God, a puritanical, not a puritanical, but a God of, I think, of the Reformed tradition in many respects. And at the end of the Declaration, that they pledge their loyalty to. So they're holding themselves accountable to God for what they're about to do. So there's clearly different conceptions in there. And then you have, at one level, you do have sort of a conception of autonomy in there. But there is also the biggest portion of the document, which I think is the most significant part in many respects, is the common law. You have 37, hold on, 37. I don't know why I'm thinking 37. Yeah, you have a number of grievances listed against the king and the parliament, all of which will make its way into the actual Constitution in some form or fashion. And that is obviously something, so it's these are the grievances. These are what we put forward against you. And now there is this call and claim for separation as an equal people, as an equally, not constituted, but an equal people. So I think if you think about the Declaration in that regard as something, there are a lot of elements that make it up, which may not exactly cash out with each other the way we want them to in a theory, but this is a document put together by statesmen trying to forge something they could all sign and pledge themselves to. So that's the way I think about it. I think maybe the point I was trying to make with Lincoln is Lincoln himself, when he appeals to the Declaration, I think is implicitly criticizing the constitutional order as the final word, or sort of just thinking about this as a document that's agreed to by people. He wants to sort of bring out the morality of what happens, of what representative Republican government is, and what the morality of the equality of persons under God. And so he is, I think, innovating on the founding. Harry Jaffa says this in more or less the same terms in his first book, Crisis of the House Divided. He'll move away from that later in his career, but I think that's important to remember, is that you can look at the founding and begin to see what questions were they asking or pointing to maybe, and draw out further, deeper moral truths for the challenges that you face as they unfold and confront us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. In it, you mentioned the importance of public trust. And, in conversations that I've had with complete strangers, Uber drivers, friends, the lack of public trust is pretty real right now. In the American system, in the government, in our Constitution. What would you say are things or, ways that we could go about regaining that public trust?
Well, in parts, I think where does the mistrust come from? So 60 years ago, there's really a Pew Research poll in the early 1960s. You had Americans voicing incredible trust. Will the federal government do the right thing most of the time? And you have like 70 or 80% of respondents saying, yes, we trust. And you ask the same question now, and it's incredibly low. And so at one level, my answer, just very, very much working forward my conservative thinking, is the government has tried to do too much and has failed, and we know it has failed. And also a government as big as ours abuses power and abuses public trust, which is sort of a marker of people's experiences with the federal government. Not that the federal government affects all of our lives in ways we don't even really calculate, but in terms of momentous public things that the federal government gets wrong. And also I think there's just a realization that policymaking at the federal level is broken, and it doesn't exactly produce outcomes that we want to attach ourselves to, or that we associate ourselves with or see ourselves in. So, right now the federal government is doing a lot of things like spending money and, providing checks. People seem to like that. What that seems to suggest about our order, I think, is pretty sad in many respects. Not to say that like in a pandemic or a stimulus there shouldn't be some sort of relief, but the ways in which that has kept going has made you wonder, what is it that we now think American citizenship means? Clearly, if we look in the federal body, the institution given the most power by the Constitution is the Congress, and it is broken. So I would argue, a lot of people are arguing to little or no effect that what's key today to reviving American constitutionalism is to rebuild Congress, because that is the central body of Republican political authority. That's where we are supposed to use to engage in what Murray called dry public argument, sustained argument, disagreeing argument that ultimately gets somewhere. And our arguments, I don't think it's fanciful to say our arguments used to get somewhere, and they don't seem to do that anymore. I think it's also, the public trust too, I wonder if it's, just unawareness of profound differences too amongst us now, the ways in which those have come to define us, and ways that I think are not healthy. So that's probably nothing interesting or new in that answer. And it's also, I think, the public trust evidences itself in the decline of the arts of association, and that people are not joining and participating in things. Those who study this would argue this. So, and also with, say, your generation, right? There seems to be distrust of everything, of everybody, and that's and that's understandable, I think, in many ways. So, yeah, that's sort of my answer in parts. And I struggle to find optimism in thinking about public trust, but I think the first key would be to perceive a government that actually is competent, and that's hard. I tend to think about when I was your age or just starting law school, 9/11 happened, and I think the failure of our policy, I say a failure, the failure of what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, in my mind, continues to loom large. The failure, when you lose, we lost the war, but when you execute a war under certain pretensions and you don't achieve your objective, that leaves a mark. The financial crisis, I think, has continued to leave a mark. The realization we're spending money that we can't possibly pay back leaves a mark. And that there seems to be a lack of responsibility amongst those who possess power, or even themselves understanding their responsibility, is also deeply troubling. And I think we all sort of sense that. So.
Thank you, that's helpful. I think we could probably have another conference on the competence of government,
Yeah.
How to get there.
Thank you for the lecture. I really appreciate the subject matter. I was wondering, a lot of the talk seemed to be about perceived failures, or undeniable failures of the federal level of our system, and I struggle to see where that failure was at the founding, because you mentioned that the federal Constitution does not put forth really what the role of the individual is in civil society or in just the broader framework. Mm-hmm. But I feel like you also mentioned why that is, and it's because the federal government left a lot of that up to the states. Mm-hmm. But with the 14th Amendment, you said we took a lot of that state autonomy away. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the answer to a lot of these questions that we're asking is increased state autonomy. The lack of trust in the federal government is a lack of trust in the federal government. I am from Oklahoma, and not everybody from every state can say this, but to a large extent, I trust my present government in Oklahoma. I don't trust the federal government. Why is the state answer not the right answer?
Oh, I didn't mean to suggest it wasn't the right answer. I largely agree with you. Much of the situation that we're in, sort of the intractability of our political debates, is because it's hard to reverse the court. When they intervene in the manner in which they have, they tend to be the final word. And so in sense of removing the self-governing capacity of states on a lot of social issues, I think you're clearly right. I agree with you. I think the bargain struck at the founding, largely is one I generally agree with. Then you've got to maintain it, and you've got to forge it through Republican argument. And there's this is something that was hard for me to understand when I was in college. Is what federalism, isn't there a template? Like, isn't there just like a formula for how we're supposed to do this? And I don't think there is. I mean, Publius mentions this idea of common constituents. Common constituents becoming more or less capable or more or less comfortable where political power is lodged in the state or the federal government. And then you have, Hamilton trying to argue for that the effectiveness and the competency of the federal government would make us more comfortable with power being lodged there. We would sort of overcome the petty jealousies and actions of state officials who would seem to have more of the people's confidence at the time. And so that debate goes on about where we're going to situate and lodge a power. But I think that's one source of our problems right now is sort of the inability to just disagree and to let that go forward and to see what happens over time. And we don't seem capable of doing that. But that's really more of a conception, I think, of our elites when they have power, particularly in the judiciary, and what they think the judiciary is for. And can we self-correct that? There's a big opportunity coming the next term.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciated it. So my question is, in the current context where a lot of the country either has kind of gone against our tradition in Western civilization is sort of, the context in which we are today being so antithetical to the context in which the Constitution was created, how can we get back to that kind of, how can we incorporate this, better than they knew it, philosophy in this context? Because, it seems difficult to be able to bring back the respect for religion in such a secular culture. How can this be applied today?
Yeah, so, these questions, I never really know how to answer them because I'm the editor of a journal that does essays, but we don't really do a lot of politics. I don't really style myself as a politician or a tactician in that regard. I think, one question is the First Amendment itself within our Constitution. What does it mean? So what does religious freedom mean ultimately? Does it matter if most of the country is secular or removing itself from religious institutions? It probably won't come to mean much. Its status will be reduced, and you can see that now operating. So how do you find a way to show that freedom of religion ultimately only matters if we think religion itself is good? And I think that's clearly the assumption in the First Amendment, that we regard religious, and in fact, we regard it as so good, we're going to prevent the federal government from establishing a national church. Now, there are certain states with established churches, but they don't have the same amount of teeth we seem to associate with established churches, and they kind of run out of steam, by the 1830s. So I think that's one question is, why is religious freedom a good thing? And something that Murray talks about, part of the American proposition, and this separates our American founding from, say, the French Revolutionary founding, is our founders are very comfortable with situating government under God, under law. There is a sovereignty higher than government. It's not the final word, and it can't define who you are. And our founding wisely ignores that. So I think to the extent we want to speak about a Christian founding in our country, the Christian founding is we have no civil religion, and that's a Christian contribution. We have no religion. We have no ideological formulation either put to us of what it means to be an American. How are we going to maintain those? And so that then becomes, I think, the spoken and written word, and our ability to go back and articulate these things to people. And why a lot of the things you think you can't account for, you really can't. What's the ground of freedom? What's the ground of love? What's the ground of trust? Can you answer that with sociobiology, determinism, or pantheism, as Tocqueville would allude to? You go back and you make those sort of foundational arguments, and then you start to begin to think with a greater depth, I think, about crucial liberties in American constitutional history.
Thank you very much.
Hello. Regarding loyalty to your state and community, which I think sort of relating to this idea of democratic territoriality. Mm-hmm. So there's the issue of the amount of uprootedness.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, people today, we deal with, like many people who move to jobs in the big city. And this has been an issue for a long time. I mean, even go back to the settling of the Northwest Territory, the movement of people, which I think does undermine communities in some way. So, I mean, how do we sort of juggle that, I mean, in our own lives, between loyalty to your community versus moving elsewhere?
Yeah, no, I think you're right when you say these things can wear down civil society and community. Capitalism itself can pose tremendous stress to community and neighborhoods in terms of where capital gets deployed, where it gets redeployed, where jobs get created, where they aren't being created. And I think about my own life. I think about my lives of my parents, my grandparents, all of whom moved to new regions and states of the country. That's always been true, as you said, in American life as well. That's always been a part of America as a people on the move. I think the question is, what do people do when they get there? Is one thing, and we have tended to be joiners to create neighborhoods, to flourish, and to find that a crucial way that we want to do things. And what might act as a solvent on that as well, and how do we, think about limiting what could, damage relational lives. I'm not as a Gracie Olmstead has the book Uprooted. I think that's what it's called, Uprooted, and that's definitely, there's something there in the sense of. But there's also something about what human beings do as incredibly fruitful, I think, spiritual, relational beings, and that wherever we're going to create new forms of community. So it's not, I don't see it as necessarily, a barrier. But loyalty itself is recognizing how deeply insufficient we are for our purposes, and how we need and require other people, and need and require things like law and the institutions of government and civil society institutions, and how these all make up a rich life. And so what that should do is sort of begin to tamp down on, our distrust, I think, unless those things aren't performing well. And that's sort of a question. Now, so I think it's sort of a move beyond sort of an asocial individualism, and being loyalty and having gratitude to things that have come before you, which you didn't create, and which you want to join and somehow be a part of in whatever capacity you can.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning.
Hey, Tom.
You kind of made the religious liberty argument just a couple minutes ago, but the argument understands religion as something being higher than and antecedent to the state. And so what free exercise does, it gives the religious bodies the freedom to operate without restrictions from a government, especially a government that gains its legitimacy from a sovereignty higher than itself. Mm-hmm. But in Employment Division v. Smith, or Employment Division of Oregon v. Smith, Justice Scalia famously argues that the general applicability of law would make it such that it's applicable to even religious believers, and a law that's generally applicable, kind of just qua law, could impinge the free exercise so long as it's not specifically targeted at a religion. And of course, he famously says that, I wrote it down, that granting exceptions to the law for religious people would, quote, make man a law unto himself, which of course is especially true given that our country does not have an objective definition of religion. They've said at times that any sincerely held belief could constitute a religious principle, even if there was no God at all. Now, much ink has been spilled over why Smith was wrong, but I wanted to pick up on where you left off with Tabor, which was how can cases like Tabor, Masterpiece Cake Shop, Fulton v. Philadelphia, which came out just this term, at the end of this term, square with Smith, and then also ground religion in a public basis with natural law in mind that actually protects religious freedom?
Yeah, no, good. Yeah, I mean, that question's at the heart of a lot of the sort of the practical, where the rubber meets the road questions and debates. I think Scalia in employment division, the sort of German positivist in him got the better of his judgment. I mean, that's always kind of what I've thought. I don't think he's necessarily wrong in that regard. It's also, I think for that really to work, you would have to have a much smaller conception of what the government is supposed to be doing. I mean, one objection there is the government is now doing so much, it rubs against us in so many ways, that what you would begin to do is have a very, very limited notion of religious freedom. And because the laws themselves generally aren't, they aren't necessarily tailored against religious believers, but they have adverse impacts on them, or disparate impacts on religious believers. So that's one response on Scalia, is I think Scalia understood himself to be working from a logical perspective of law, a logical perspective of the sovereignty of the law and what it could demand of individuals. He's also very upset in that opinion with the balancing test regime that had been a part of religious freedom litigation and decisions for the preceding decades. He hated balancing tests, period, because he thought they allowed judges to achieve the outcome they wanted. I don't think there is an easy answer with regard to what a regulatory state does. The Fulton opinion, the Masterpiece Cake Shop opinion, I think clearly produced evidence that things were being tailored against religious institutions. I mean, that's why the Philadelphia situation seemed to be struck down, and they were making all sorts of exceptions for race. You could limit who you adopted by race, but yet the Catholic Social Services Agency couldn't have its standard, and of course, no one had even come to it requesting a same-sex adoption, but still it was being thrown under the bus. The same thing with Masterpiece Cake Shop. So if I were to think about that, I think what we will have to do is the balancing test overall and recognize there are burdens both ways that are being imposed. And what you have to do is ask yourself, well, which burdens are weightier and which, ultimately what's at stake? And so this kind of comes back to the preceding answer. If you think religion is good and religious freedom is good, then I think that balancing test even if you look in the court's period when they were doing the balancing test, I think there's only one or two opinions where they thought the burdens on the public outweighed the religious freedom right. So I think it seems to me something like bake the cake. I mean, that seems to be pretty clear. And there's going to be a lot of other options that where you could go. So that to me was, that was clearly, you're going to do this. And we're going to put this in your face. It's a public ideological teaching you're going to conform to. So I think I don't think there's any way around the balance. If we start to regard religion as hateful, as bigoted, as something that destroys who people are and their identity, then I suppose we'll start to lose a lot of those cases. And so that's, I think, the importance of, RFRA is the response to Smith, but that's a statute. Statutes can be overruled, obviously, or can be dismissed. So you want to find, I think, a way to work this back in constitutionally. Yeah.
Thanks.
We've got time for one more question. Thank you for your lecture. So you talked a lot about sort of relational personhood and community. And so our table was wondering, how can we have any sense of public trust or loyalty when such a large portion of the country doesn't share a religious conviction? And as we discussed a few minutes ago, people are so mobile that we as Americans don't generally have loyalty to a certain land/home/place.
Well, I don't think relational personhood depends on a religion. I think this is empirical. Really, it's an empirical account of who human beings are, and I think the law itself should support these different dimensions of our nature and of our actions and of who we are and what we do. And so it's really a very narrow philosophical conception of who we are, and that modern liberalism posits. And so you want to, with the relational personhood, you want to claim, one, there should be checks on government for these things to flourish, and you also want to make sure you're supporting those things in various ways. And so one idea would be we want to have libertarian means for non-libertarian ends. So maybe we don't want to have the government running our health insurance requirements or dictating health insurance markets or dictating higher education because we think these things matter as who you are, as you're constituting yourself, as you're flourishing as a human person, you would actually want to have great freedom in the choices that you make. So that would be a libertarian case. But the point is to flourish as a relational person. And I do think it's, the religion point is, I think these things historically were best protected. And I think philosophically are best protected when we have an understanding of those duties themselves, being things we're responsible to God and to others, and that sanctions them. But no, I don't think that. And the community point, I don't know that I could do better than just kind of how I responded. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.